There's a lot more to be said about communities, but let's move on to institutional organizations, by which I mean hospitals, schools, factories, barracks, universities, bureaucracies, ecclesiastical organizations, NGOs, you know, like Medicine Without Frontiers, Greenpeace, one of the millions of non-government organizations that exist out there. Organizations are also made out, are assemblages of people, assemblages of persons, in addition to material and expressive components, like their buildings, their desks, the communication and information processing machinery that they may have, whatever equipment they may need. If it's a military organization, the assemblage must include the weapons. If it's an industrial organization, the assemblage must include the factory or the machines. If it's a hospital, the assemblage must include not only the doctors, the nurses, the patients, but the beds, all the medical instrumentation, all the medical equipment, the laboratory to test things. That's what the assemblage is. I mean, remember, assemblage theory is a way of thinking about it, about social entities as concrete social entities, with their buildings, with their day-to-day practices, with their spatial and temporal limitations, and so on. So institutional organizations are also made out of persons. I'm going to be double underlining each one of these entities. But they are different than communities in that a majority of institutional organizations have what is called an authority structure. There are bosses, and there are people who follow orders. And there may be several layers to that hierarchy. So in the case of hospitals, it might be doctors, nurses, patients. In the case of schools, it might be the superintendent, the teachers, the students. In the case of workers, it may be the CEO, several layers of middle management, supervisors, at the end of at the bottom of it all, workers. If it is a military organization, well, of course, you have all the different ranks from lieutenant to sergeant to private and so on, all the way down and all the way up to captain and general and so on. And even in the case of families, you have an authority structure. The authority structure of a family can be patriarchal, as it used to be for a long time. It can be matriarchal, as it exists in some other societies. Or it can be a mixture of both, as it exists in today's Western world. But the children have to obey. And obedience, then, is part of an institutional organization in a way in which it is not part of a community. In a community, not even the leader of the community, the most popular person of the community, gets to give orders. He might suggest that you do something and you might do it, but he doesn't have the authority to give orders. Authority depends on the existence of an authority structure within an organization. So we're talking about a different social entity, a different social assemblage. Now, when you talk about legitimacy, this place here, legitimacy as one of the emergent properties. When you have authority, you can, of course, impose your authority or enforce the authority through punishment, right? Someone disobeys an order, you kill him. Someone disobeys an order, you fire him. Someone disobeys an order, you incarcerate the person. But direct physical enforcement on a day-to-day basis is very expensive and destabilizes an authority structure. So if an authority structure is going to last for a long time, if an organization is going to have a long life, it is much better if in addition to being able to enforce its authority has legitimacy. If it's seen as legitimate. So when someone gives you an order, you join an organization as an employee, and some other person who is above you gives you an order, you might question, well, is that a legitimate order or not, right? You may have been hired as an artist, and this guy who you know is above you sends you to get a cup of coffee. And you might very well say, well, is that a legitimate command? Am I supposed to fetch coffee for this person? Or is that outside of the definition, of the task definition of my contract here? Right? So legitimacy is a very important component of an organization. The main author on questions of legitimacy, his name is Max Weber, a very famous sociologist, writing at the turn of the past century, or at the beginning of the 20th century. Weber considered in his theory of legitimacy 3 possible sources of legitimacy. For very small organizations such as sects, religious sects or guerrillas, charisma, the charisma of a leader can be a source of authority. Charisma can be, it's a personal quality of course, but it can be exhibited in a whole variety of ways. It can be oratory prowess. It can be your detailed knowledge of a sacred text. You can recite verse and chapter of the Bible or the Quran or something like that. It can be the courage you showed in a battlefield. So the perfect example here would be Al-Qaeda when it began, that is the Al-Qaeda of the late 90s, with Osama bin Laden as a charismatic leader. Osama bin Laden not only had fought in Afghanistan, had proved himself as a courageous warrior, which gave him a certain amount of charisma. He is supposed to be a very good orator, and he's supposed to know his Quran, you know, from beginning to end, and being able to pinpoint every part of the Quran. So that is what gives him charisma, and that's what gave legitimacy to his commands for a long time. So Max Weber considers that the very first form of legitimacy. It's the most primitive form of legitimacy. But as Weber says, when a group grows past a certain size, past 100, past 200 members, charisma stops being very effective. And moreover, charisma is always subject to succession crisis. You know, because charisma is not freely available. Not everybody is as charismatic. In fact, we know that the 2 lieutenants underneath Osama bin Laden did not have that much charisma. And so when the charismatic leader dies, and you have a succession crisis, who is going to replace the leader? Who's going to succeed him? We need something equally charismatic, right? Think of, you know, Fidel Castro. What's going to happen when Fidel Castro dies? He's incredibly charismatic.
Raul.
Excuse me?
Raul.
Well, but he is like an anti-charisma guy. Right? He's going to have to find another source of legitimacy, because right next to his brother, he has like negative charisma, right? It's like all the charisma genes went to one of the brothers, right? And he may never die for all I care. I mean, Castro is like one of those villains in Friday the 13th, right? You stab him, you throw acid in his face, you cut off his arms. Is it dead? Yes, it's dead. You turn around and he comes back. Then you turn back, you throw a flamethrower at him, you chop him into little pieces. Is it dead? Yes, it's dead. You turn around, he comes right back.
Wait, how do you really feel about Castro?
Yeah, don't sugarcoat it for us. Don't sugarcoat it. You know, give it to us straight. So, says Max Weber, a long time ago, it must have happened. It could have happened in Mesopotamia. It could have happened in Egypt. It must have happened in one of the earliest dynasties that actually lasted. Charisma was transformed into something that was inheritable, something that was transmittable through the bloodline. Of course, that is a myth, as we can see just by looking at Prince Charles, right? I mean, the guy doesn't have absolutely any charisma whatsoever. Nevertheless, if you can craft a myth that you can put into a text, a foundational myth, according to which God gave legitimacy to that first charismatic leader, and then that charisma or that legitimacy is passed through the bloodline, you have transformed legitimacy from charismatic to traditional, which is a much more stable form of legitimacy, and it encompasses organizations of a much larger size. Aristocratic organizations, ecclesiastical organizations, and certain military organizations in which the rights of govern, the rights to lead are passed along a bloodline. Finally, there's a third form of legitimacy that Max Weber considers, And that's the legitimacy of organizations like bureaucracies that in which their legitimacy is based on whether they can actually get things done, whatever it is that the organization does. If the organization polices the stock market, well, its legitimacy is based on how well it polices the stock market, how few stock market crashes there are, right? If the organization is one organization that's supposed to prevent natural disasters and assist people after a national disaster, well, its legitimacy is going to be depending on how well it carries its task of saving those in danger of a natural disaster. I mentioned this example earlier on. FEMA, the American organization in charge of disaster relief, during Katrina hit on a Monday, and there were all these people trapped in bridges and so on. FEMA doesn't show up. It comes Tuesday. People are starving. They are dying of thirst. FEMA doesn't show up. FEMA shows up until Friday. Well, FEMA lost legitimacy in the eyes of everybody. It didn't really matter that George Bush was going to the guy, you know, a heck of a job, Brown, you know. It didn't really matter. Everybody else saw FEMA as a delegitimized organization. And the only way it can get its legitimacy back is by confronting another natural disaster of that proportion and actually performing well. Now in the United States, this is particularly important because that is the only source of legitimacy that bureaucracies have. Bureaucracies are not mentioned in the Constitution at all, so it cannot derive legitimacy from unmentioned in the founding text, and they are supposed to be staffed by career bureaucrats, right? That is, people that are not elected, so they cannot derive legitimacy from the popular will as expressed in the voting process. Now, it is important for bureaucracy to actually be staffed by professional bureaucrats as opposed to elected officials, because that way the bureaucracy works on the basis of the capacities of the people that staff it and not at the whim of political winds. Up to 1872, the United States had a system called the spoils system, according to which the winner of the elections, whether it were Republicans or Democrats, got to put their people that had worked in their campaign, in key positions in all these bureaucracies. That was in fact the way it worked. You attracted people to your campaign to work for free as volunteers because they knew you were going to give them jobs in specific bureaucracies. But because those people were not trained to do anything, you know, if it was a bureaucracy in charge of water, or in charge of food, the Food and Drug Administration, or in charge of any other thing, they had to know about that subject. But if they are just political appointees, they of course had very dysfunctional bureaucracies. The spoils system was finished in 1872 by law, even though to this day, at least the heads of organizations can still be appointed by the president on the basis of absolutely nothing. I mean, Brown, the guy who had FEMA, the closest he had gotten to a natural disaster is that he once owned an Arabian horse called Hurricane, I believe. Those were his credentials. You know, do you know about hurricanes? Yes, I had a horse named Hurricane. Come here, Hurricane. Hey, boy. So, obviously, it still happens. And for that reason, bureaucracies lose legitimacy. Today the word bureaucracy does not connote what it connoted in Max Weber's times. Max Weber, of course, was German, was part of the Prussian state, in which bureaucracies were particularly efficient. So when you read his book, bureaucracies are talked about as something admirable. Today the word bureaucracy connotes red tape, connotes lack of efficiency, connotes all kinds of things that diminish the legitimacy of bureaucracies. Nevertheless, that is their source of legitimacy. Now, my argument here is going to be that the legitimacy of an authority structure is an emergent property of the whole. How am I going to defend it? First of all, you could argue, well, but doesn't the legitimacy of a particular organization depend on the fact that the people who belong to the organization believe in that legitimacy, believe in that religious authority, or believe that the organization it has a commendable goal that they should own? Well, yes, it does. For this property not to be transcendent, it needs to depend on certain properties of the person and interactions between the persons. But the question here is this. does it depend on any particular combination of beliefs? Or does it only depend on there being some set of beliefs or another? Let me give you an example. You might go to an organization, a hospital, a prison, a school, and interview the employers as to what is, why do you think the authority of the doctor is legitimate? So, or why do you believe, why do you follow orders on a day-to-day basis in this organization? One might answer the question, well, my family has been a civil service family since I can remember. My grandfather was in civil service. His grandfather was in civil service. We have a family tradition of being civil service. We believe in civil service. That is why I am part of this bureaucracy. And that's why I believe in its legitimacy. The other one might answer, well, no, I'm not part of a civil service, long tradition family. I'm the first one. But I happen to believe in the goals of this organization. I happen to believe that we do need an organization for disaster relief. And I'm a doctor, and I believe that I can help this organization. The third person might say, hey man, I signed a contract from 9 to 5. That's the reason I obey commands. I obey commands from 9 to 5. I obey commands because they give me my weekly check. That's it. I don't even know what this organization is about. Right? But they obey commands. They obey commands. Now, the question is if we shuffle these people around and take out some of the civil service, long tradition family of civil service and replace them with 9 to 5ers, do we get roughly the same degree of legitimacy at the whole? Well, sometimes we will, sometimes we won't. But if we do, if shuffling the details at a personal level leaves the level of legitimacy roughly the same, then legitimacy is independent of the details. If we shuffle the people around and legitimacy changes completely, then legitimacy is not an emergent property. Right? Emergent properties means that that even though you depend on the day-to-day interaction between these people, you don't depend on the details of who they are. Just as in the case of communities. Remember what I said before, right? In a community, you might take a poll one by one and ask them, why are you solidary with this community? One people might say, well, it gives me fuzzy feelings of togetherness. Another people might say, well, I was born altruistic. Ever since I was a little kid, my mother didn't have to tell me to share my toys with others. I would just share them. A third person might say, hey, I'm a cold, strict reciprocator. I'll do you a favor, but I expect that you're going to pay me that favor back, right? In all three cases, solidarity is going to emerge. And so the question is, for a given community, if we shuffle people around and take some of the altruists and put some strict reciprocators, if the level of solidarity remains the same, then the level of solidarity does not depend on the details of the autobiographical details or biographical details of the persons. If by shuffling we cause a drastic change in solidarity, then solidarity was not completely emergent, okay? Because it still depends on some of the personal details. It can be reduced to the personal details. Well, the same thing with legitimacy. A bureaucracy in which everybody's a 9 to 5er might have the same level of functionality than one in which everybody comes from a long line of civil servants. Now, the long line of civil servants might be more motivated because they now have a family tradition to be part of. But if we check out the day-to-day workings of the organization and the basic level of functionality remains the same with a bunch of 9 to 5ers and a bunch of long-time civil servants, well then legitimacy is an emergent property or the organization. It depends on there being some or other beliefs about legitimacy in their staff, but not the particular details. That should be our criterion for emergence from now on. If a property of a whole depends in detail on the properties of the parts, then it is not irreducible. To the extent that the property of the whole is independent of the details, it is fully emergent. Then let me just give you one more example. In the three different forms of legitimacy that we have, charismatic, traditional, and bureaucratic, or as Weber calls it, rational legal. In the rational legal system, resources are attached to an office or to a role, and not to the incumbent of that office. In other words, you can dispose of resources of the organization, you can spend the budget of the organization, you can create projects for the organization using resources that are attached to the office, but if you're replaced, then the new incumbent is the one that has control over those resources. In other words, the personal details of the incumbent don't matter that much because the resources are attached to the office. Right? So you can replace one incumbent by another incumbent. If an organization, once we studied in detail, empirically, turns out that the resources of a particular position in the hierarchy depend on the caprice or the whim of the incumbent, well then that organization, the legitimacy is not fully emergent because that person is making decisions that are entirely personal and are affecting the entire organization, right? So in explaining how that organization works, you would have to give the details of that person. He is a very capricious person. One day he wakes up wanting to spend a lot of money. The following day he wakes up not wanting to spend any money. And that you would have to use as part of how the organization works. If you have to include the details, those personal details, then legitimacy is not fully emergent. If the resources are attached to the office or to the role, and have nothing to do with the incumbent, you replace the incumbent by another incumbent, then the personal details of the incumbent don't matter. When you explain how that organization functions, you don't have to mention the incumbent. You just have to say, there's got to be somebody there, of course, but not necessarily this one person or that other person. Okay? You had a question?
Yeah, I was wondering what you say for cases where there has to be some range of some things, but if it strays outside of that range, then the details immediately begin to matter. So if you had a bureaucracy, and I don't know that this really would be the case, but let's just imagine that if everybody were doing it 9 to 5, it would not work. It would become dysfunctional. I don't know if that's true, but it works. It's fine as long as it's only somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3. As long as there's a mixture of beliefs that extends beyond just that, it works fine. But if everybody goes to the one thing, then it ceases to function. Would you
I would say that the majority of cases would be like that. That is why I said about communities. It is not necessary that everybody in the community knows that you broke a promise. And it is not necessary that everybody in the community ridicules you, laughs behind your back. And it's not necessary that every member of the community remembers that you don't keep your promises. As long as a large enough number of community members does, the mechanism works.
So then there's a space at the edge of that where the institution shifts from being an emergent, legitimacy shifts from being an emergent property in that institution to being no longer emergent. I mean, that's just arbitrary. Yeah. 2/3. You have one more person, suddenly the specific details of everybody do matter. And you have one person less who's just a 9 to 5er, and you're back to being emergent.
Yeah, I don't see why that would not be possible, right? I mean, I wonder if there was ever a case in which one person would make a difference. But yes, you know, certain organizations, for particularly non-governmental organizations like Doctors Without Frontiers or Greenpeace, do depend on the staff being highly motivated. I cannot imagine, let me put it this way, Doctors Without Frontiers, with all the suffering those guys have to go into all those different countries and so on, that you could just replace all the doctors in Doctors Without Frontiers with regular, I need to get paid now doctors, right? You begin to change them, and all of a sudden the solidarity of that organization would fall apart, right? When exactly is the critical threshold? We would have to measure it empirical, right? And unfortunately, we don't get to play those experiments. So, okay, let's replace one good doctor by one bad doctor. Still works. Let's now put 2 bad doctors, right? If we could do that, and perhaps one day we will be able to do it with computer simulations, once multi-agent systems get, you know, once each one of those agents gets enough artificial intelligence that they can mimic some personal interactions well, we might be able to conduct those experiments and see try to find out where the critical thresholds are. But I would still insist that it would be an empirical question, because it would depend, you know, certain government organizations, I would say, work perfectly well with 9 to 5ers. you don't really have to believe in, Security and Exchange Commission's goal to, you just have to be someone who knows about finance, and you're going to work 9 to 5. But Doctors Without Frontiers, Greenpeace, organizations like that, they need morale. They need commitment. You're going to have to make a lot of sacrifices, and your salary is not really perhaps even that good. So all the motivating factors are out, and the only one is the mission of the organization. So perhaps in some cases, you do need a very specialized type of staff for the organization to function.
And so, this is what I'm getting to. Do you think then we can say that large-scale social change happens where an organization's legitimacy or other key emergent property shifts from not being emergent to being emergent, or from being emergent to no longer being emergent?
Well, I never considered that case, but it is possible, right? I mean, in the sense that an autocratic government that is very functional, people might resent it because it's autocratic and because it imposes its commands too harshly, but at least it works. And then it works because the resources are attached to the office, not to the incumbent. Then all of a sudden it gets taken over by some very powerful, very charismatic leader who now starts making all the resources to depend on him. Now that has changed the thing. Now it has become less emergent because there's less separation between incumbent and office, right? And now it becomes less efficient, clearly. Now it's the whim of the guy that determines whether this thing gets done or doesn't do. And now people might not put up with it, with the autocracy. Hey, we put up with your centralized decision making and your overbearing authority as long as you worked. But now that you don't work, we're going to rebel against you, we're going to destroy you. Yes, Nick?
I think my concern is a little different. I feel like there's this deep flattening of the social world into these readily legible caricatures, which, those readings of feudal systems where you've got a king and you've got a serf and everything just makes sense, or those readings of gendered systems where you've got a man and you've got a woman and everything just sort of plays its way out. The social world is really complicated.
Can I stop you here for a second? This is the beginning of the class. At the end of the class, I want to end up with 10 more of these things. Can you hold on your complaint? Because this is the question and answer period, not the complaining and answer period. Wait until I finish. How can you possibly say that when I'm at the beginning of the thing? I'm going to start making more connections here. Well, I need to go one by one, because otherwise I lose you all, guys. I cannot just throw everything at once. Hold that question. I'm not going to answer that question right now. I don't even care. Hold that question, Nick, but I'll answer it at the end of the class. Wait until you see all the different entities that I'm going to put in there, and then you see me if I'm flattening, and if they are caricatures, or anything like that. Right? And be careful with your words too, okay? So, let's start moving on, people. We have already established then a criterion for emergence. Emergence is immanent. It does depend on the existence of some or other beliefs and desires on the part of the components. Altruism, a desire to belong to the community, a respect for authority, or a 9 to 5 commitment to a job. But it does not depend on the details of that composition. To the extent that it does depend on the details of the composition, then the property is not emergent. The property, in other words, when you try to explain how that entity works, you're going to have to include a description of the persons, or at least some of the leaders. Now, the next criterion for emergence is this. When an emergent entity has become stabilized, it can, that is, when it has become an assemblage, it can become component parts of larger assemblages. In a way, all assemblages are assemblages of assemblages. Because a person is itself an assemblage of a body and a mind, and the mind, if we believe Hume, is an assemblage of intensities and a crystallization with those intensities. If we believe Kant, is an assemblage of categories and faculties. So a community is an assemblage of persons, but persons are themselves assemblages. Now, before I move on, I have to say one more thing. Remember something I said from in the very first public lecture. I said that all entities in this form of materialism have the ontological status of individuals. Now, I admit, I recognize that the word individual has become synonymous with person. We normally talk about the struggle between the individual and society, or individual human rights, right? But the word individual doesn't necessarily have to be synonymous with person. We can speak of individual communities, right? This community, that other community. We can speak of individual cities. These cities, Venice with its history, its personality, that other city, Florence with its own history, its own personality, this city, New York, this other city, Geneva, and so on. They're individuals, right? And I gave you the example of the human species as an individual, as opposed to as a category, right? An individual has a date of birth, the moment of speciation in the case of a species, and at least potentially a date of death. In other words, every entity that I'm going to use here is a historically constituted entity. It must have been born at some point, and there must have been a process that put it together, and it could be destroyed. It could die. It could die for a variety of reasons, right? Communities disappear. Sometimes they disappear during a famine. Sometimes they disappear during an epidemic. Sometimes they disappear because of emigration of old young people, because there's no jobs locally until the town becomes a ghost town. So each one of those entities is an individual, but of course not an individual person, right? It's an individual entity, individual communities, individual organizations.
I can answer. I think it's very compelling and everything, this assemblage theory, but you know as well, you've written about this, that metaphors or not metaphors, ways of understanding the body or that come from biology are often extrapolated to society and everything. And this originates in Deleuze and Guattari, apparently, and they have a very transdisciplinary approach. But do you think that there's not the danger to use assemblage theory in this partial relation on biology, on sociology, on everything without generalizing? Because with organicism in biology, for instance, this was strongly tied to fascism. This is just one example.
And it's a big mistake to think of society as an organism, because everything is harmonically related, and that was the functionalism of Parsons.
Is there no danger of this extrapolation in assemblage theory? I guess that's my question.
Well, assemblage theory was born in Deleuze and Guattari anyway. I am the one who projects it over physics and chemistry and biology. In their own work, it's always social, right? When in postulates of linguistics, Guattari defines assemblages as collective assemblages of enunciation. In addition to the characteristics that I'm giving here, he gives the enunciation part has to do with the fact that in an assemblage, speech acts have a bonding function, is what holds together the assemblage, right? What is a speech act? The speech act is a promise, it's a command, it's the I do, when say, do you marry this woman? Yes, I do. In other words, there are acts that are affected by the very fact that you say something. Yes, I promise I will do it tomorrow. Well, you've created a social commitment by saying a particular thing, right? They took this, of course, from a famous English philosopher called Austin, who wrote a book called How to Do Things with Words, which is a very interesting title. I don't think it was the original title. It's a bunch of lectures, but nevertheless, it's an interesting title. And he mentions, of course, promises, commands, threats, and a bunch of other things in which the very utterance of a sentence or of a phrase commits you to something. You've been warned. You've been commanded. I committed myself because I promised this, right? And I've been stressing those things here, right? There's commands in institutional organizations, and broken promises, unreciprocated favors, and so on, are what I stressed as part of the communities. Because yes, speech acts by creating social commitments, create more or less permanent social bonds. And if you break the commitment, then that's something that's punishable. If you disobey a command, that's punishable. If you break a promise, then that's punishable. What kind of punishment there's going to be depends on whether you're in an organization or a community.
Because my question is more, can you use the same ontology without qualifications also for biology and everything? Because as you said before as well, there is no such thing as science. But now you are using assemblage theory to explain chemistry, to explain basically everything. Does that work without further qualifications, or do we need to differentiate this ontology?
Well, it needs further qualification. I give further qualifications in the books. Right? I'm not going to be able to get into that right now because it would throw me off completely. I mean, I want to continue with the social world right now, if you don't mind.
Yeah, okay.
Tomorrow we will be talking about science, so tomorrow I'll address that question, okay? I am the one who's extending assemblage, because to me assemblage theory, first of all, the word assemblage shouldn't ever be used by itself. If you're going to be talking about communities, use the word communities. If you're going to be talking about interpersonal networks, use the word interpersonal networks. You use the word assemblage only when you want to define the ontological status of that community. You want to say it is not a Hegelian totality. It is not something in which everything is fused, right? Because you can, of course, take a member of a tightly knit community in a small town, and that migrates to the big city and never comes back. And we're not going to say that that person who left the community and went to the big city, that he lost his identity, right? But if we saw communities as Hegelian totalities, then we would have to say that the person who leaves the community loses his identity, and that would simply be empirically false, right? So the word assemblage should only be used as a theoretical term to explain the ontological status of certain entities. But when actually carrying out assemblage theory in practice, you should always mention concrete assemblages. Right? If you're talking about communities, say communities. If you're talking about institutional organizations, say institutional organizations. That will prevent the word assemblage from becoming a general category. Because it's only used for one particular purpose, explaining the ontological status of those entities. So it's at the meta level. Once we get to the object level, we should always use the names of specific assemblages, right? Okay, so let's move on. And I'm gonna, right now, start adding more arrows. Oh, first of all, let me actually explain one more thing. Those arrows that go upwards right now are the arrows of emergence, we might call them. In other words, a community emerges from the day-to-day interactions between the people that compose it. If the people that compose a community stop interacting because they hate each other or whatever on an everyday basis, then you don't have a community anymore. It depends on that. Nevertheless, and the same thing with an institutional organization. In an institutional organization, it depends on the fact that everybody's going to be following commands every day without questioning them. If every day everybody questions every command and needs a special explanation, and you have to give that in writing and sign it and so on, that organization falls apart the following day, right? So that's what that arrow means, that ultimately, if these guys are not interacting, these guys are going to fall apart. But I have to add another arrow that goes downwards, and I'm going to put it in dotted, because once an assemblage emerges, precisely because it has properties and capacities of its own, it can begin affecting its own members. And so it can begin constraining them or enabling them. Right? So a community, precisely because it can act as an enforcement mechanism and a reputation storage device, actually acts to constrain persons. So there's an arrow of causality that goes downward, right? The community as a whole can make persons a little more honest, can keep them in track. And the same thing with an institutional organization. Every institutional organization has a book of rules. This is why Weber called it rational legals, a form of legitimacy, because they have rational in the sense of matching means to ends, getting things done, and legal in the sense that the regulations are typically in written form. They are very codified. Via those codified regulations, an organization can act back, can react back on the very persons that compose it. So the arrows of causality go both ways. Go upwards, because these entities emerge from the interactions of persons, and they go downwards, because once an assemblage is become stable enough, it can begin restraining its members in certain ways, but it can also begin to enable them. For instance, by being members of a community, the community as a whole might be able to ask the government for something, and the government might give that community a particular right to water rights or land rights for their cattle. But if a single person had asked that from the government, maybe they wouldn't have been granted to. So by belonging to the community, you're not only constrained, but you're also enabled. And the same thing with an organization. The resources of an organization, at least for the people at the top of the hierarchy, are greater than the resources of any of its members. So being the boss of an organization, it constrains you because your role is highly regulated and you're not supposed to do certain things like sending nude pictures through, Twitter. You're not supposed to tweet your underwear and regulations like that. It constrains you, but it also enables you because you can use the resources of the organization to do more things than you could do personally. So those are the two arrows here. Let's start putting a few more arrows. First of all, what would be an assemblage of communities? When several communities, not the persons now, but the communities themselves come together in the form of an alliance, a coalition. Well, one of the better examples that we have of that are social justice movements. Beginning with worker movements in the 17th and 18th centuries, moving on to the 20th century with the women's movement, the civil rights movement, a variety of social justice movements, whose most important goal is to extract certain rights from government organizations. In the case of workers, to extract the rights for collective bargaining. In the case of women, to first extract the right to vote, to then extract the right to be able to be in universities, to then extract the right for equal treatment and equal pay. In the case of civil rights movements, to extract the right to effective vote, to extract the right to go to non-segregated schools, to extract the right to not to have to go in segregated buses and segregated transportation. All those rights were not granted by government organizations willingly. They had to be extracted from them. And they had to be extracted from them using a very specific device. Large-scale, peaceful demonstrations that were numerous enough, that contained several communities, that government organizations had to say, we have to give them this right, because we depend on those guys as taxpayers. In the case of males, we depend on those guys as possible soldier recruits for a particular war, so we have to give them those rights. Now, that particular device, the mass civil peaceful demonstration, was born at a particular point in time. The person to read here, his name is Charles Tilly. He's a historical sociologist. Tilly does a very good assemblage analysis, without using the word, of course, but meeting all the specifications that we have here, of social justice movements. And he shows us how, of course, prior to 1750, in England, the way in which communities demonstrated their anger and demonstrated their desire for more freedom were very aggressive. Were things like destroying machinery, or feathering and tarring the taxman and kicking it out of town. They soon realized, though, that those tactics did not have any long-term strategic value. They did not gain him any rights. And so little by little, the device of the mass demonstration in front of office buildings was born. This is between 1750 and 1850. By 1850, it's perfected. Today we know that everybody around the world uses that device, whether Western societies or not. I mean, the Arab Spring today has been based on that specific device. Right? And it has to do with, it needs to be a coalition of communities, because a government organization is not going to be moved by a single community of 200 people staging some little demonstration in front of a building. But if 5 or 7 communities like that get together and form a coalition, and now you have 1,400 people in front of a government building, they begin to pay attention because you're expressing not only your numerousness, which could grow if other communities add themselves to the coalition. You're expressing your unity by the very fact that all of you are there civilly and peacefully, right? And you're expressing that there's a single purpose, right? When several communities form a social justice movement, many times they have to leave aside many grievances that they may have that only belong to that community. You know, grievances about a particular factory or a particular division of land or a particular use of water. And they have to come together under a single goal. We're going to extract the right to collective bargaining. And this is what we're going to focus on today. And if you focus several communities on that one goal, you actually get it. And you actually get it not because the government organization is nice, but because it looks at potential taxpayers, potential recruits, and sees that mass as dangerous to its own authority. So we can consider social justice movements assemblages of communities. Now, you might say, well, but wait a minute. When several communities come together and form an alliance, it's not as if the entire community showed up to the meeting. They typically send a representative. They send a community organizer, 2 or 3 community organizers. And the ones who actually established the alliances say that there were 20 communities involved, and each one had 2 community organizers. Well, it's going to be those 40 persons, who are going to really get the coalition going, right? So doesn't that mean that we can reduce a social justice movement to those 40 people, to those 2 community organizers per community that actually got together and hammered out the details of the coalition? Well, let's use our criterion. If we replace those community organizers by other community organizers from the same community, and we did that replacement, would that coalition still have been done? If the answer is yes, well, you can doubt because it's an empirical question, right? We have to do it, we have to check it case by case. It's not a priori. But in the empirical case, in which replacing the community organizers by other community organizers, the same coalition got done, well then, the personal details of the community organizers don't matter. And therefore we can speak of the whole community as having come together. If, on the other hand, it was this specific community organizer, you know, a Fidel Castro with his charisma, it was indispensable to do this thing, then when you explain the history of that social movement, you're going to have to mention that guy. You're not going to be able to leave him aside because his personal details or her personal details matter. What's going to obtain in any particular case is an empirical question. There is no a priori decision here. So let's put solidarity here as the emergent property. Now let me do one more arrow here. I'm putting there another assemblage. It's a very specific assemblage. It only applies to some countries, in this case the United States, and other countries that have a federal government, like Mexico. But there are many other forms of government. Everybody knows that, right? Parliamentary governments, autocratic governments, theocratic governments, or aristocratic governments. We can use one at a time. We need to examine. A federal government is an assemblage of organizations. Not an assemblage of people anymore, but an assemblage of organizations. And in the case of the United States, the organizations are thousands of organizations, literally. Now, in the case of the United States, there are several sources of heterogeneity in this ecology of organizations. Number one, the checks and balances idea, invented by the French, but then implemented by the American founding fathers, which is a good idea. Separate executive power organizations from judicial power organizations, courts and police stations, from legislative power organizations like Congress and the Senate. Separate them out so that they can check each other's power. But in addition to that, in a federal government, you have that division of organizations at the level of the entire country, but then you also have that same division at the level of each one of the states. Each one of the states has its executive power, its governor. Each one of the states has its courts. Many states even have a Supreme Court that's local to that state. And each one of the states has its own senators and House representatives, or deputies, as they call them in other countries. And then you have the local governments of cities, with its mayor. Now, they may not have a Senate and a Congress anymore, but they may have certain council bodies that are in charge of creating laws for that particular city. And they, of course, have their local police and their local courts. So what we have here is an assemblage of organizations that's incredibly complex, right? And the reason why it's important to do it is, and authority, jurisdictional. Has become jurisdictional. In other words, a federal organization like the FBI has authority over the entire country. A state police, like the state police of Utah, or the state police of New York, or the state police of Florida, has authority over up to the limits, its jurisdiction stops at the limits of the state, at the limits of the state of Utah, the limits of the state of Florida, limits of the state of New York. And then there's the local police, New York City Police, Philadelphia Police, Boston Police, whose jurisdiction, or the limits of whose authority, end up at the limits of the city. What this means is that there will be overlapping jurisdictions, right? And there will be inevitably friction at the limits or overlaps of those jurisdictions. You can imagine, a corpse that is found right at the border of New Jersey and New York, right? So New Jersey police, state police, and New York police both show up to examine the corpse, and perhaps the person who found it was someone local police from the closest city, right? So if the first person on the scene is a police from, say, Jersey City, shows up, and they think that that's their case. But then New Jersey State Police and New York State Police show up, hey, wait a minute, this is not your jurisdiction anymore. But they begin fighting with each other, because the corpse is right at the border, hey, is this a crime committed in New York? Is this a crime committed in New Jersey? And as they are fighting with each other, the FBI shows up and says, look, this is a diplomat. Doesn't belong to either of you two losers. This is an FBI case. Get out of here. We're taking over this case, right? Now, the point of example is that government organizations don't work harmoniously. There's plenty of friction because of the overlapping jurisdictions. And the most important governmental process where you're going to see this is in the implementation of policies. We normally think of implementation of policies, think of the public health or the healthcare system signed into law by Obama. We normally think of policies as a matter of decision making. There's a lot of debate in the Senate, and there's a lot of debate in Congress. And finally they agreed and they take a vote. And they say, yes, we're going to approve this new law for the revitalization of our cities. Okay, well, it goes to the Senate, they approve it. And finally it gets to the executive desk of the president. The president, in a big ceremony with cameras and everything, signs the Revitalization of Cities Act, right? And we think that that was the end of the matter. All the debate, well, yes, all the debate, but now it's finally law. Well, think again. When a law is signed, that is the beginning of the problem. Because now you're going to have to start thinking about how you're going to implement that law, right? The very first thing to decide is, well, this is a healthcare law. So which organizations operating at a federal level need to be involved? Well, the Food and Drug Administration is going to have to be involved because drugs, medicines, are involved. But also the Environmental Protection Agency needs to be involved because we're going to need to know about the effect of asbestos and the effect of pollution on kids' lungs and so on. And so you start numbering the number of agencies that want a piece of the pie, that want a piece of the budget, right? And of course, each one of those agencies is going to want a piece of the pie that's as big as they can get, regardless of their merits, regardless of the rationality of the action, right? So there's going to be infighting already at the federal level. Then each one of those agencies, the Food and Drug Administration, the Environmental Protection Agency, and so on and so forth, is going to have to call on its state-level counterparts, you know, the Food and Drug Administration Agency of Utah, the Food and Drug Administration Agency of New York, the Food and Drug Administration Agency of Pennsylvania, and so on, one state at a time, saying, guys, you're going to have to play ball, you know, you have to join in, but of course each one of them is going to add one veto point, right? Because each one of them can then say, yes, we agree with everything except the individual mandate. For instance, in this particular case, remember the individual mandate is by 2014, people without insurance are forced to buy insurance, which is one big thing right now about the Tea Party. They hate that, right? So one agency among many states might just decide, yes, but we don't like that individual mandate. And because they've introduced one more veto point, now there's one more obstacle to the implementation of the policy. And even if there was not that, each one of those state agencies now have to rally every single city in the state and the local agencies of every single city, because those are the ones who eventually are going to have to dispense the money. Those are the ones who are going to have to build the new hospitals. Those are the ones who are going to have to train new doctors. Those are the ones who are going to actually implement the policy. Right? And because it takes time to do all this, it can take years for all these little conflicts to be resolved, there's plenty of time for other organizations to sneak themselves in and to say, hey, wait a minute, this touches upon my territory a little bit. Not a lot, but enough that I should get a little chunk of the change there. You know, you have plenty of time for the policy to become distorted by special interests at each one of the levels, federal, state, or local. And the problem with this, and you can read this in there's a series of books on implementation. I don't remember the author right now, but you can find him in Amazon just by typing the word implementation, is that studies of the implementation of federal policies that have followed the implementation process year after year, all the way to 10 or 15 years when it's finally finished, show how distorted the policy becomes as this process of implementation goes on. Now, why is this important? Because we tend to, theoretically now, at the level of theory, call this thing, this assemblage of organizations, this complex assemblage of organizations, we tend to call it the state, which is fine because we need to give words to things. But when a word connotes too much of a monolithic structure, and the word the state connotes that, right? Just let the state decide, or let the market decide. And you start opposing the market to the state as if they were two monolithic entities, right? Then you forget about the complexity of implementation, because you forget that a federal government is an ecology of organizations, some of which are warring against each other, some of which have turf disputes, some of which have jurisdictional overlappings that cause friction on a day-to-day operation. So if we're going to be realistic about government policies that implement new things or that change society for the better, we need to take into account that it is a complex assemblage of many organizations. Remember that in the past, we have not thought that way. And I don't want to start attacking Marxism right now, but Marxists had a conception of the state that was relatively monolithic. Relatively, say right now, because you cannot generalize over every Marxist. Trotsky was different than Lenin. Lenin was different than Marx. Marx was different than Engels. All of whom were different than Gramsci and Rosa Luxemburgo, and so on and so forth. But they had a relatively monolithic theory of the state, and therefore they thought that socialist planning was in fact relatively simple. I mean, relative to the anarchy of the market, as Marx used to call it, where millions of decisions independently made supposedly create prices that self-organize and so on, but lead the capitalism to crisis after crisis. If the government plans everything over a 5-year cycle, well, there has to be a lot more order in a country. Well, yes, if the state was monolithic, if decisions made by government were implemented exactly the way in which this 5-year plan said they would be implemented, but once you begin to think that over 5 years, those decisions are going to get entirely distorted, then you begin to distrust central planning. You begin to realize that central planning cannot possibly be the solution because it doesn't even work in countries like the United States, which are supposedly functional, let alone third world countries, which are very dysfunctional, and in which, in many cases, the office and the incumbent are not separated. That's one source of corruption, right? When the incumbent of an office can actually dispose of the resources of that office at will, and so get bribes in order to give those resources in a particular direction. But even in the absence of corruption, the very complexity of this assemblage shows you that implementation needs to be thought carefully. It needs to be thought as a process that is full of friction and full of potential accidental and contingent events that might, derail it. Okay, let me just add one more set of arrows here, because we're going to be returning to that later on. I'm running out of space, so I'm going to do it diagonally. This is going to be another assemblage of organizations. Let's call this industrial networks. There are several types of industrial networks. Let's think, for instance, right now of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler back when General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler were General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. So let's project ourselves back to the 50s. General Motors was the node of a network of organizations, which were, of course, its suppliers. Suppliers of spark plugs, suppliers of tires, suppliers of aluminum for the body car, suppliers of pre-assembled carburetors, suppliers of all kinds of components, the leather for the seats, the plastic for the floor, and so on and so forth. And distributors, which in this particular case were mostly car dealerships. But that was already something, and if you count the number of organizations in that network, probably was 200, 250. General Motors itself, a giant organization, of course, dominating its suppliers in the sense that it could tell them, yes, I'm going to buy 100,000 spark plugs from you, but if you give them to me at this cost. Or I'm going to buy 1 million pre-assembled carburetors from you, but if you meet my specifications, and so on and so forth. So it dominated their suppliers in the sense that they could exercise power over their suppliers, and of course, dominated their distributors. In the sense that General Motors could tell car dealerships just what kind of things to sell, when to change the models, when to organize a sale for the old year models, and so on. So that would be an assemblage of organizations, 200, 250, 300, with a dominant node. General Motors in one case, Ford in another case, Chrysler in another case. Now, there are other industrial networks without a dominant node. There is, for instance, a very famous region in Italy called Emilia-Romagna. It's a very old region. If you look at maps from the Roman Empire, there is already there Emilia and there is already there Romagna as separate regions. They are not particularly touristic, so the cities that organize those regions, you might not know. Bologna, everybody has heard of Bologna, and of course, Bologna had a university already by the 11th century, so it has been a center of learning for the whole millennium. And it has another city, another famous city called Modena, which, if you heard of it, is because they designed Maseratis and a bunch of other really fancy cars there. But the region as a whole has about 20 to 30,000 small industrial firms dedicated to mostly the production of textiles of a variety of different types, textiles for furniture, textiles for clothing textiles for curtains and so on, and ceramics of different types. Tiling, those are mostly to sell to the architects for architectural decorational purposes. And they also design the machines with which they print and weave the textiles and with which they produce the ceramics, right? They are unlike the example I just gave you of General Motors with one giant dominant node and a bunch of captive suppliers and distributors. Here there's no giant corporations. There's about 20,000 small firms, 90% of which have less than 100 employees. Now the most important thing is this: of that 90%, 50% of the firms are design independent, meaning they do their own design. And they compete against each other in terms of design. Right? Now, who does the best designs for textiles, for ceramics? The other half works for Benetton or works for another, Celanese or other large corporation who just outsources certain jobs to them. The design is kept in-house, the design is kept at Benetton, and they just give the actual manufacturing to this other 50% of the firms in Emilia-Romagna. But let's concentrate then on the 50% with less than 100 employees that actually produces their own designs. These people have realized for a long time, because Emilia-Romagna has been around, this particular industrial network has been around since the 60s. First of all, it experienced a period of explosive growth that made everybody around the world notice. Two very famous MIT economists, Sable and Piori, and I'm running out of room here to put the names. Sable and Piori, I can give you the names if you want me to. The name of the book is The New Industrial Divide. Went to Emilia-Romagna for 5 years to study the region. That's how much of a phenomenon this was. There have been several books written about Emilia-Romagna because it seems to be an entirely different industrial paradigm based on small firms. Why do small firms matter? Why does it matter they have less than 100 employees? Well, for several reasons. Number one, when you go beyond 100 employees, 500, 600, 1,000, accountants and managers start becoming more important than designers. Right? When you have less than 100 employees, the artistic talent, the designers are the ones who count. If you can recruit enough talent, then you're a successful company. If you cannot recruit enough talent, then you are not a successful company. Artists drive the process. Number two, they compete against each other not in terms of costs, although they of course have to take costs into account, the costs of raw materials, the wages, the taxes they have to pay, the rent they have to pay on their buildings. But cost is not the most important thing for them. The most important thing for them is design. So they compete in terms of design. They put their little booths in international fairs and they show their textiles right next to the other people's textiles. Now that implies a very different type of competition. Because when you compete in terms of costs, it pays to get big. Because as you get big, then you reap economies of scale. If you're going to be mass producing certain textiles or mass producing certain ceramics, well, it pays to be big. Because the larger you are, the lesser the cost per unit of identical product, of mass-produced product. So the larger the run of mass-produced products, the higher the profit per product, right? So if you're not going to compete in terms of design, if you're going to compete in terms of cost, it pays to get big. So here it is very important they compete in terms of design because that's one of the reasons why they have deliberately stayed small. How do they stay small? By splitting when they become too big. And that brings me to my third point. When you have 20,000 firms with less than 100 employees, there is not what economists call barriers to entry. Now, barriers to entry means what happens, say, in the automobile industry in the United States when you have Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors as dominant. Yes, you can start your own car company, Tesla, or you can, there were many small companies that started in the 40s and 50s, right? And they can have great designs. But one or two things happen then. The large ones buy you out in a process called vertical integration, right? Just like Microsoft just bought Skype, or just like Google bought YouTube, or just like large corporations buy small ones. Or they wipe you out of existence. They wipe you out of existence because they are competing in terms of cost, and they can sell cars at less than a cost in order to gain market share and expel you from your tiny little, in other words, and that's what is called a barrier to entry. That a new company cannot come in because the large companies are, by their very presence and their very activities and the economic power they can exercise, they are a barrier for the entry of new companies with fresh ideas. In Emilia-Romagna, there are no barriers to entry. If you are a company with 100 employees that suddenly has grown to 150, 200, a worker, someone that was was a worker, not even an entrepreneur, but a worker who happens to be a good designer, can walk out with 10 or 15 of his or her buddies and start a new company. If all of the companies have less than 100 employees, well then a company with 20 employees can compete, right? As long as they can do design, as long as they can compete in terms of aesthetics, in terms of creativity. So slow barriers to entry means that growth can be achieved by splitting. Now remember that I'm not giving you this example as a theoretical example. I'm not saying assemblage theory predicts that if you have a lot of little assemblages, then fairness will prevail. This is a real region of the world about which many books have been written. And you can check all the facts that I just gave you simply by checking Sable and Fiore beyond the new industrial divide. Emilia-Romagna works. Today they are a little bit in trouble because of competition from China, because of competition from outsourcing labor to cheaper companies. And so what they decided to do and the EU, the single currency, also kind of threw them out of whack a little bit, because that means that everybody from other parts of Europe can come in and compete. So they decided to fight back in the early 90s by creating 3 organizations that they call consortia, that are huge organizations, exactly the opposite of Emilia-Romagna, in charge of particular activities in which economies of scale do pay. So for instance, logistics, everything having to do with the transportation of goods, with the warehousing of goods, with accounting. Those are not particularly creative activities, right? So, and those are activities that do pay. The larger the warehouse, the lower the cost of maintenance. The larger the containers for shipping, the lower the cost of shipping, and so on and so forth. So they decided to create a single consortium to handle the logistics for all of the little firms. The difference is the consortium doesn't own them. They own the consortium. So the consortium cannot exercise power over them. They are now using the consortium to protect themselves against invasion by larger rivals. They also created a consortium to handle finance. Why? Because small firms, unlike large firms which are public and sell stock in the company, a large company can sell stock, can sell bonds, and finance itself that way, and just issue new stock every time they need $2 or $3 or $4 million. They just issue new stock, the stock sells immediately, and they have $4 million. Small companies are private, they are not public, so they don't have stock. They have to go to banks to get credit. But a bank is going to look at a small company, and sometimes they will give you credit, sometimes they won't give you credit. So financing is a problem. So they created a consortium which deals with banks directly in the name of the little companies, right? Finally, they designed a consortium to handle all the marketing needs, branding, and going to fashion fairs to detect fashion trends. Prior to this, every single one of those 20,000 firms sold its textiles and its ceramics under its own brand, and that was, to put it mildly, a mess, right? So, when they consolidated themselves with this consortia, 100 different products from 100 different firms were now sold under the same brand. They lost the power of branding, but they kept the power to design, and that is what matters. Each one still designs its own textile and its own ceramics, and it kept its small size, right? Which is what matters. So here we have what is basically a hybrid of large companies, the 3 consortia, and 20,000 small firms. This is a real case. Now, if you want, and I'm going to finish in a second, another case that you can benefit to study these two types of industrial networks is a book called Regional Advantage by Annalise Saxenian that compares Silicon Valley and a region, an industrial hinterland outside of Boston called Route 128. Silicon Valley, of course, has very large corporations, Xerox, Intel, some companies that began very small, Apple that began with $1,300 in a garage, Hewlett Packard that began with $1,000, Google that began in a dorm, and so on, have become huge. But when you do the analysis of Silicon Valley, the actual census of the population of organizations, you realize that small ones still dominate. That there's a lot more startups, which have to start up small, and so there's a lot more creativity, there's less barriers to entry. Silicon Valley has some of the characteristics of Emilia Romagna, less so because of the presence of large corporations like Intel and Xerox and now Hewlett Packard and Apple, but nevertheless has some of the characteristics. A population of organizations dominated in numbers, in percentage, by small firms. They are dedicated to innovation and they compete against each other in terms of creativity. It's a different type of creativity. The other one is graphic design, basically, of ceramics and textiles. Here is, hardware design, software design, and within software design, game design, applications design, operating system design, apps design, and so on. But nevertheless, many small companies, whereas Route 128, and you guys might be a little too young to remember this, but it was the center of the mini computer industry. You guys might not even remember mini computers, but they were extremely expensive, $70,000 a piece, desktop computers, which were the real challenge. This is before the personal computer was born. We're talking about the early 70s. The real challenge to IBM's mainframes, right? And they were produced by only 3 very large corporations: One, DEC, and Digital, all of which were in Route 128. So this book, Regional Advantage by Annalise Saxenian, compares a region in which the population is dominated by small firms with a region in which the population is dominated by large firms, and compares them over 3 decades, which is a very important thing, because in an economic upswing, everybody does well. So in an economic upswing, you cannot judge which one of the 2 regions does better, because everybody does well. So she waits for at least two downswings in the economic cycle to compare the 2, and shows how Silicon Valley was much more resilient to a downturn, was much more adaptive, was much more witty, much more kind of, capable of shedding a few small firms, of adding more small firms and keeping up with the trends, whereas One, Digital, and DEC have all disappeared. They all tried to do everything in-house. Remember that Apple didn't do that. Apple put out the Apple II with what is now called an open architecture. You could open the Apple II, the original Apple, and there would be empty spaces for boards, and Apple gave away the specifications of the bus, the place where you plug the boards, and allowed a cottage industry of small firms to develop manufacturing those boards. Some firms manufacture video grabbing boards, for filmmakers. Other manufacture number crunching boards for mathematicians or scientists. Other manufacture music synthesizer boards. But those now were not designed or manufactured by Apple. Apple gave birth to hundreds of small little companies around it that could create hardware and could create software for its machine. In Route 128, DEC, Digital, and One decided to do everything in-house. So of course, each one had its own operating system, each one had its own word processor, each one had its own, and what they, since they had a corporate clients, they would sell the entire package to the corporate client. And they lasted for a while. They lasted until 1985, 1987. Some of them lasted until 1990. But they just could not keep up with the rate of innovation in the personal computer business, right? Not even Apple was able to keep up. Apple, by 1990, was already in the doldrums, right? They had to bring Steve Jobs back, which is the one who kind of injected new ideas with the iPod and the iPhone and so on. So, but the book is very interesting because it shows you two areas of the United States, one and the same country, with entirely different industrial styles. And you cannot tell that unless you analyze the details of each region. You could not have told that a priori. You needed to do empirical work and gather evidence a posteriori. Right? Now, we're going to stop right here, but I want you to keep this in mind, because just like thinking of the federal government as an assemblage of hundreds, if not thousands of organizations with turf wars and jurisdictional disputes makes it goofy to speak of the state. Just goofy, not illegal or illegitimate. You can continue to use the word if you want to, at your own peril, because you're implying monolithicity. You're implying that it is more monolithic than it is. So, the discovery that there are many types of industrial networks, some in which there's less barriers to entry than others, and therefore more social mobility than others. Because the less barriers to entry, the easier it is for a worker to become a boss. This should give us pause when we think of such a thing as the capitalist system, as a monolithic thing. If you have workers and bosses, if you are paying them wages, well then that is capitalism. That is the definition of capitalism. But if you think that way, you're going to overlook these differences. Because of course at that level, Emilia Romagna and Silicon Valley on one hand and Route 128 on the other are indistinguishable. Both have bosses, both have workers, and both have wages. Right? But there are distinctions to be made here. And these are important distinctions, particularly when you are somebody who is a social activist or somebody who wants to work towards a fair, juster world. The idea of changing the capitalist system as a whole seems almost like impossible unless you believe in the revolution. Right? But the idea of changing specific industrial networks seems much more doable. And now all of a sudden, new avenues for thinking about how to produce things open up the moment you start thinking of industrial networks as assemblages of organizations that can be of different types, with dominant nodes, without dominant nodes, with barriers to entry, without barriers to entry, with more social mobility, with less social mobility. Let's always stick to those distinctions, particularly when we can marshal empirical evidence in their favor. Guys, I'm going to start taking questions when we come back from lunch.